I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest news from across the front lines, update on diplomatic developments from Germany, Hungary and Poland, and Dom explains the crisis in the Red Sea and its relevance to the Ukraine war.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's gonna break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Thursday, the 21st of December. 1 year and 300 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor Dominic Nichols and Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Yeah, well, hi, David. Hi, everybody. So let's start in the air again. Continuing the trend of recent weeks, Ukraine shot down 34 of 35 Russian drones launched in an overnight attack. This is according to Ukraine's Air Force. So Russian occupiers, here's the quote, Russian occupiers attacked with Shahed-type UAVs from three directions. From Chadar, that's the far east of occupied Crimea, that's over near the Kerch Bridge. From Primorsko-Akhtarsk, that's on Russia's Sea of Azov coast. From Kursk in Russia, about 150 km north of Kharkiv as well, according to the Air Force. They were talking about multiple waves of attacks coming through the night. So air alerts in many Ukrainian regions across the centre, the southeast, the north and the northeast lasted for hours. 2 women were killed in Nikopol, that's 50 km. Well, there are different Nikopols. This one I've checked. This is 50 km southwest of Zaporizhia on the north bank, the right bank of the Dnipro. Deaths there, not the one over further to the east. There was also shelling in the Sumy area all through yesterday. Now, the front line in the east and the south has seen continued Russian pressure, continued efforts to achieve something to be portrayed as a success as we get towards the year's end. They have achieved small gains, meters, sometimes hundreds of meters, but look at the unit of measurement I'm referring to there. So Michael McFaul, US ambassador to Russia between 2012 and 14, now professor of political science at Stanford University, he said today, how come no one's been writing about the Russian 2023 counteroffensive that completely failed? After sending tens of thousands of Russian boys to slaughter in Ukraine this year, what gains did Putin achieve? That point has been backed up today by retired US General Ben Hodges, who said the Russian narrative about Ukraine losing and Russia's endless resources is false, but accepted by too many hand-wringers in the West. 9 years of war, all the advantages, and Russia still only controls 19% of Ukraine. So, yeah, useful perspective, I feel. Now, separately, Ukraine's Air Force spokesman Yuri Inat said that, he said 3,700 Shahed drones had been fired at Ukraine in the past 15 months, with 2,900 shot down. The interception rate is lower for missiles. He said Ukraine had downed 1,600 of the roughly 7,400 launched by Russian forces since the start of the invasion. Now, I report those stats because he said it, and they do seem to chime with our sort of assessment of it as we've been talking through the years plural. But I would note, and I would just for perspective, air defense, Ukrainian air defense has got a lot more capable and integrated in recent months. So I would expect the interception rate to be much higher now than in August 2022 when Mr. Inat's stats begun. So it'd be interesting to see a sort of comparator kind of graph. I imagine the curve, if you like, of successful interceptions would have gone much, much higher. Almost, if they've done 34 out of 35 last night, it's up over 90%, isn't it? Now, sticking with stats, and Alexander Stupin, a Ukrainian army spokesperson, had said his country has destroyed 200 Russian tanks in the past 2 months alone. He said, in a little over 2 months, the enemy has lost almost 25,000 people killed and wounded in Donetsk Oblast alone, and about 200 tanks and more than 400 other armoured vehicles have been destroyed. He said 80% of those losses were near Avdiivka. Just points you back to the comments by Ben Hodges and Michael McFall. And finally, a few more stats. We'll find you for this a little bit anyway. A few more stats. Ukraine has scaled up its production of first-person view drones in recent months. So Alexander Kamyshin, who's Ukraine's industries minister, he said that 50,000 of these drones have been produced since the start of December. FPVs, you may remember, so the first-person view drones, this phrase that we've all got to get used to because it's going to stick around for a while. They're basically modified civilian drones, relatively cheap, flown directly onto targets as opposed to kind of having a parabolic curve or a certain amount of energy. They've got to just find a target or ditch. And also they are armed is the important point. They're not there just for reconnaissance. Flown directly into targets with explosives attached. Kyiv has announced plans to produce 1 million FPV drones next year. This is the fight. This is the way that war seems to be going. Next, Ukraine. Interesting one, this. Ukraine will recruit Ukrainians living abroad and may sanction those who do not show up to recruitment offices. This is coming from new Defence Minister. I can't call him new anymore, sorry. Defence Minister Rustam Umerov. He was speaking. He's in an interview today with German media outlet Die Welt. So he's in today. He's given them an interview. Now, obviously, it comes in the wake of President Zelensky's press conference on Tuesday when they were talking about this requirement from the military of 450 to 500,000 new soldiers. Zelensky, at the time, he said that he was sort of not minded to immediately sign up to that without a number of key issues being addressed before he could officially support it. He reportedly instructed Defence Minister Umerov and Valery Zaluzhny, head of the armed forces, to formulate a new plan for mobilising a huge number of people. Umerov said that Ukrainian men living abroad would first be invited, his word, invited to report to recruiting offices, but added that measures would be taken if they did not show up willingly. He said, "We are still discussing what will happen if they don't come voluntarily." Well, I've just said that. Now, the BBC reported in November that as many as 650,000 Ukrainian men of military age were thought to have left the country mostly for Europe, elsewhere in Europe, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And just as a reminder, under the current martial law in Ukraine, it's prohibited for men aged between 18 and 60 to leave the country, barring special circumstances. So, this discussion about do you mobilise? Where do you get the people from to put into uniform? Is very live and is gathering pace and momentum, and that is a very interesting development there. Now, yesterday we spoke of Putin's flirtation with the negotiation fairy. I said at the time, he was talking about negotiations. I said it was hogwash, designed to flush out those in the international community who would like to grab at this idea of negotiations, which right now would be on terms unfavourable to Ukraine, rather than stick side by side with them in their fight against Russia. In case there's any doubt, responding to a question yesterday, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov explicitly stated that the Kremlin is uninterested in negotiations with Ukraine. However, in order to keep the misinformation charade going, in the next breath, he said the prerequisites, his word, prerequisites for negotiations are absent. So I think that pretty much sums it up in a nutshell. So Russia is not interested in negotiations until the prerequisite of Ukraine being defeated is in place. It's basically what they're saying. Now, the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, say that this feigning of any interest in negotiations with Ukraine is done in order for Russia to cast itself as a responsible party and then blame Ukraine for refusing reasonable Russian negotiations. So it rumbles on. If we've already got Schrodinger's drones, here we've got Schrodinger's negotiations, that it's they're not interested, except that they are, as long as it's on their terms. But they're really not interested. And then finally, for me, Switzerland. Switzerland has announced $13 million in winter aid for Ukraine, announced a new 11.5 million Swiss franc, that's just over $13 million, winter aid package for Ukraine yesterday, brings the total of Switzerland's winter assistance to Ukraine to around 26 million Swiss francs, about $30 million. $30 million being roughly the cost of one refurbished Leopard tank that Switzerland won't allow Germany to send to Ukraine. And I'll take a pause there, David.
Well, thank you so much, Dom. Joe, let's go to you next. There's been quite a few updates across Europe in the diplomatic and political space. So where would you want to start? Maybe Germany?
Yeah, let's start in Germany, where the federal prosecutor, who's the Prosecutor General, Peter Frank, has filed a motion in Frankfurt to confiscate 623 million in seized Russian assets, which have been frozen by Berlin. That's according to the newspaper Der Spiegel. The funds historically belonged to an unnamed subsidiary on the Moscow Stock Exchange, which was sanctioned by the EU in June 2022. And these funds would be redirected into Germany's federal budget if the claim is successful. So a G7 decision to freeze Russian assets immediately after the February 2022 invasion has estimatedly frozen around 230 billion pounds of Russian assets. Russia has threatened the European Union in return, saying, and the EU, to give some context, has said it will look into using the profits generated from frozen Russian assets to basically give to Ukraine. And this is what the Russian finance minister had to say about that plan. We also have enough assets that are frozen here in Type C accounts. The figures are not small. The income from using these funds is substantial and certainly also be used if a decision is made by our unfriendly partners. One example of that is, and it's actually quite interesting, we should probably do some digging into this at some point, the largest ever insurance claim against theft is being made by a company at the moment because of planes that have essentially been lost to Russia when the war started and everyone closed their airspaces. Planes weren't allowed to leave Russia, and Russia has kept sort of billions of pounds worth of leased planes. But yeah, we should go into that, maybe do a deep dive at some other stage, because that's an interesting one. But yeah, there's lots of stuff in Russia that basically Russia is threatening to keep as well. So Germany has said it will provide an additional 88.5 million euros to help strengthen the resilience of Ukraine's energy system. That comes as we all know Russia is targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure over the winter in the hope of basically freezing Ukrainians into submission. Back to Russia, the Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova has warned the deployment of German armoured tank brigades to Lithuania from 2027 would lead to an escalation of military tensions between Russia and NATO. German soldiers will permanently be stationed in Lithuania, which shares a border with Belarus, and it comes after Denmark became the latest Scandinavian country to permit permanent US troops on its territory, basically as everyone is bolstering that eastern flank of NATO by putting troops there. So Britain's enhanced forward presence in Estonia, I believe, is where Labour leader Keir Starmer has been visiting over the last few days. Over to our friends in Hungary. Some may say friends, others won't say friends. Hungary's Prime Minister has said funding to Ukraine must not be granted from the EU's budget. So Viktor Orban has said, I am convinced that to give Ukraine 50 billion euros from the EU budget for 5 years is a bad decision. You'll remember back to my reporting from the EU summit last week when Viktor Orban vetoed a sort of a really key financial lifeline for Ukraine being drawn out of the EU's budget. So with leaders not expected to overcome Hungary's opposition, they are looking at doing what's known as an intergovernmental agreement. Basically, EU 26, so minus Hungary, will come together and then hope they can formulate a plan outside of the EU structures. So this is what Viktor Orban has to say. They want to give the money to Ukraine from inside the EU budget. Hungary wants to give it outside the EU budget. They have the possibility, if we don't agree on this, to resolve this outcome resolve this outside the budget, but don't have the option of resolving this from the EU budget without Hungarian approval. So he's basically saying, yeah, go and do it outside of the EU's budget. And then over to Poland. The Ukrainian infrastructure minister has met his counterpart in Poland to discuss a cargo blockade on their shared border by Polish truckers. The Polish drivers have been blocking several crossings with Ukraine since Monday, demanding that the EU reinstate rules where Ukrainian drivers would need permits to operate in the bloc, and the same for European truckers looking to enter Ukraine. Infrastructure Minister Alexander Kubakov said on Thursday that he met the newly appointed Polish counterparts. Poland has just changed their government, And he said, we held the first meeting with the newly appointed Minister of Infrastructure of Poland, a guy called Dariusz Klimczak, in Warsaw. We discussed several issues in the transport sector, but the main topic was unblocking the border. So yeah, whether that's going to work, but as we know, Ukraine's land borders are ever important because of the Black Sea presence from Russia. And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, for that. Let's zoom out a little bit then from Europe and Ukraine. Let's go south to the Red Sea. Dom Nichols, you've been looking into this just a little bit for us. We know this is the thing, right? It seems detached from what we're talking about, but there may be players we're familiar with lurking in the background, and this could have a profound impact on countries around the world in the next few weeks and months. So, Dom, can you just introduce what's happening in the Red Sea?
Yeah, so the Red Sea, that bit between the Suez Canal flowing down to around the Horn of Africa into the Indian Ocean. Last few weeks there's been a lot of activity, drone strikes, ballistic missiles, mostly attributed to the Houthi rebel group based out of Yemen, Iran-backed group there, that are either trying to fire things, we think, at Israel or just at any US target in the area. They've got a lot of Navy ships, US Navy there, Navy ships, or also at commercial vessels. We know they've tried to board and have successfully boarded some vessels there. There's been a resurgence of piracy off the sort of Somali coast. Potential there. Suggestions that's been spiked a little bit by Wagner. The Wagner group still exists. Might not have Prigozhin at its head, but it still exists and is active across Africa. So the Red Sea has seen a number of drone and ballistic missile strikes in the last couple of weeks, attributed to the Houthis. So that in and of itself is quite a development. It speaks again of how non-state actors, terrorist groups, for want of a better word in this context, can have an effect on the globe. And there's a very interesting point here. So that in and of itself is interesting militarily, about the cost of some of these things. You know, the propensity of drones, how cheap they are to manufacture, even the ballistic missiles, although somewhat inaccurate, but they don't cost as much as the air defense missiles and the systems that are kind of needed to shoot them down. And that is true, but that is the false way of thinking about it. You've got to think about the cost of what the target might have been. So if the Houthis fire missiles and sink a ship, or blow up a load of oil storage facilities in Saudi Arabia, as they have done in the past, you know, the potential there, the cost of that's the cost you've got to look at, not the cost of the air defense missile to shoot the thing down. So it is a worrying development on the military front. But if you zoom out again a bit more and look at the global economic implications here, there's a really interesting article in today's Telegraph by Philip Pilkington, chap I don't know, spoke to him for the first time this morning, seems like a nice guy. He's written in our business section today, worth a look, it's online as well. He's talking about how the second Suez crisis is upon us. Now, the first one, 1956, we kind of gloss over a little bit, not this country's finest hour, so let's park that one for a moment. But in the second, he's saying that what the Houthis are doing, it could well be that they are, in effect, establishing a de facto blockade on the Suez Canal by preventing commercial maritime vessels' entry into the Red Sea. The economic effects of this would be profound, he says, and in just the last week, he says global shipping companies have diverted around $35 billion worth of cargo. If you don't go through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea and you go around the coast of Africa to go from the west coast of the Atlantic through to the Indian Ocean and further east, that's a long way around. There's a big old lump of Africa in the way. So it's hugely costly to not use Suez Canal and the Red Sea. Now, the shock to trade could be similar, he suggests, to that we experienced during lockdown when the whole global supply chain seized up. But he's saying this one could be even worse. I'm going to quote a little bit from him. He said, during the lockdown, supply chain disruptions, policymakers buried their heads in the sand. Economists should know that a large disruption to the supply side of the economy will result in inflation. But policymakers, giddy from the powers the lockdowns granted other sectors of government, ramped up fiscal expenditure and loosened monetary policy. We have been living with these effects ever since, in the form of spiralling inflation, a cost of living crisis and high interest rates. Now, he also references Politico, who highlight the cost here that the Pentagon is saying about the cost of missiles and drones, but I would urge you to put that in the context of what's the cost of the target they're trying to hit. Anyway, Philip says, our second Suez crisis is here. The world could look different after it than it does now. There are many unknowns and we have far less control than we would like. We should batten down the hatches. Another inflationary storm is coming over the horizon. So he's suggesting if the effects that we're feeling now, which is possibly or largely drawn back from the policies enacted during lockdown, this could be very similar if the whole global supply grinds to a halt on account of this action by the Houthis. Then the wider implications, not only the immediate term, but also years down the line, could be very profound indeed. And so I think that's worth noting, worth having a look at. And just, I don't think I'm being too tin hat conspiracy here, but, the Houthis are very, very heavily supported, almost couldn't exist without Iran backing them. And it's not too big a leap, I don't think, to suggest that Russia has been asking Iran maybe to put a little bit of oomph and bit of pressure on their proxies down in Yemen to do this, because it diverts the world attention yet again. We're already trying to cast our eyes in a number of different ways of what's happening in Israel and Gaza and so on. If we're now looking also at the Red Sea, it yet again diverts our attention potentially from Ukraine. But also, if this does mess up global trade, it's going to be having a profound effect on an economic system which Russia is increasingly disconnecting itself from, or is being disconnected from. And therefore they might think that they have nothing to lose by spurring the Houthis to take this action. Just a thought.
Thanks so much, Dom. Let's go to our final thoughts. I don't know who wants to go first. Joe, why don't you go first?
And I don't have a thought per se today, but what I do want to do is give a shout out to Anthony, one of our regular listeners who got in touch with us to share some messages from the Hungarian government. So Anthony lived in Hungary for many years and as a result is still attached to their mailing system. And basically since the European summit, they have been bombarding people's inboxes with these messages. And I will read just two of them to you. So, dear Sir, Madam, Hungary is under enormous pressure to immediately agree to Ukraine's membership of the European Union against Hungarian interests. There is also enormous pressure on Hungary to contribute to financing of the Russian-Ukrainian war. This is in spite of the fact that Hungary has not even received the funds needed to increase the salaries of teachers. We have launched a consultation on the protection of Hungary's sovereignty. You can have your say on Ukraine's membership of the EU and financing the war. Let us stand together for Hungary's sovereignty. Second one, dear Sir, Madam, the consultation questionnaire on the protection of our sovereignty is now available online. These are issues that fundamentally affect the economy and security of our country. Brussels has decided to start accession negotiations with Ukraine. They still want us to contribute to financing of the war. They have not asked the people about this, but the Hungarian government is doing so. Please have your say. You can now do so online. And then it lists a website for Hungarians to go and visit. It's quite disingenuous of the Hungarian government to be saying this. Yes, Hungary didn't take part in the accession vote, as we reported the other day, but Hungary has plenty of opportunities. Viktor Orban himself said Hungary has about 75 opportunities to block Ukraine actually joining the EU. And we've got to remember, this is a process that could take decades. Some people talk about 2030, but actually that is probably on the optimistic side. So it's just Hungary sort of using Ukraine and the Hungarian government using Ukraine and a bit of EU bashing for basically domestic consumption. And trying to bring teachers into it. And basically ensuring that everyone likes Viktor Orban's worldview in Hungary. There you go.
Thank you, Joe. Dom Nichols.
I also am going to refer to a listener email that we got. And thank you so much for sending these, as I always say. Now, I sought permission from the listener to read this out. I said I'm very happy to change names. Actually, I don't need to change names. I'm not going to use a name, but got permission. And this is in relation to, I was saying earlier on about, I occasionally talk about Switzerland's position of neutrality and this idea of neutrality, and where is neutrality as a concept in the 21st century when you're faced with an illegal invasion by a permanent member of the Security Council. No other way to dress it up. It's a permanent member of the Security Council and it's illegal. That's it. Don't give me any of your whataboutisms. That's it. It's illegal. Right. So, an email from a Swiss national. I'm in my 20s and I live in a rural area around Zurich in Switzerland. I have been listening to your Ukraine podcast nearly every evening for months now. Right. I want to thank you a lot for being so persistent in reporting the current situation of the war between Ukraine and Russia. The war has changed my perspective on Swiss neutrality. I used to be patriotic about Swiss neutrality being such a robust tradition for many years, not expecting a full-scale war could happen in Europe. I remember serving in the armed forces as an officer, training recruits when the invasion broke in the news. For most people in Switzerland that I know, the injustice of the invasion was clear from the beginning on, even more than the annexation of Crimea in 2014. This made it difficult for me to continue supporting neutrality. What good does it bring to pretend to be militarily and/or politically neutral when the injustice is this obvious? I think in the interconnected situation Switzerland now stands with its neighbours, being neutral only enables political opportunism and ignores how history has changed. I welcome that some parties now openly question Swiss neutrality, starting a discussion about its role in mid- and long-term future. While change will probably be too slow to affect support for Ukraine in the war positively, it might have started a domino stone falling in the direction of Swiss alignment towards Europe, be it in or outside of the Union. End of the letter. Thank you. You know who you are, because you and I have chatted over social media, email. But thank you so much for sending that in. Really do appreciate it, and I really do appreciate you giving me permission to read that out. I think that is a vital contribution. What is neutrality today, as you say, when the injustice is this obvious? And I think to have the self-awareness to examine these hard-held beliefs. I would love everyone to be neutral. I would love there to be no war, etc., etc. Okay, but I just don't think that's realistic. So your position as a former officer in the armed forces who believed in neutrality, to have changed your opinion in the light of new facts, I think is very commendable. And I wish there was more of that honesty around Europe, particularly in the corridors of power. So I urge all of us to continue this conversation about what neutrality means, and if it is still helpful or if it is now unhelpful. And I would urge us all to have this conversation with people around us. It is not an easy one because it comes from a position of you already sort of accept the darkness of humanity rather than saying why can't we all be friends. But I think it is important to have. So thank you so much for sending that in. I'll welcome any more thoughts on this. Let's do keep the conversation going. And and as I say, we do read every email that you send in, and we try and respond to as many as we can. But thank you so much for your thoughtful, considered and empathetic contributions to this podcast.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.